The air beneath Berlin felt thick as grease, steeped in rust, sweat, fear, and mold. At 58, Sergeant Major Franz Becker had gone numb to it. His nose listened for something else, the faint, damp, earthy scent that seeped through hairline cracks in concrete, the sign of living water, or at least pooled water not yet poisoned. He carried no lamp. He moved by memory and by the cold wall under his fingertips, threading through secondary corridors that twisted like intestines. Behind him came a silent knot of civilians, a dozen or so men, women, and children. In the dark, their eyes shone with hunger and a stubborn, unreasonable hope. They trusted the old soldier in the outdated uniform and rigid bearing because for 72 hours, as Berlin broke apart overhead, he had found them safe corners, overlooked tins, and now water. Left, Franz said, his voice dry but clear, riding over a distant dull tremor. 23 meters, maintenance shaft on the right, seepage on the wall. Catch it with containers. It won't be much, but it should be clean. Watch the cables underfoot. The message passed in whispers. The group hurried. Franz stopped at the bend. He did not need to follow to see it. The blueprint in his head was already open to the right square. A 1.5-meter shaft built in the autumn of 1941 to carry communications cable, half abandoned after an upper redesign. Groundwater notes for this sector showed a stable, shallow level. His blueprint did more than map walls and lines. In fly-spec handwriting, it held material batches, maintenance dates, and seep points he had tracked for years, including which valves came from which 1942 production lot where sealant was likely to fail, and which pockets of soil smelled like clean water. It was his life in paper form, a record that stayed precise when the world did not. A stifled cry broke the corridor's hush. The civilians clustered and turned on one another in the dark. A boy, 7 or 8, was gone. His mother's voice tore into a wail. "Max, he was right beside me. He said he saw light over there." Franz felt his stomach drop. His warning about cables had not been a figure of speech. This was no main evacuation route. It was cluttered with deadlines, unsealed pits, and worse, a hazard he had marked years ago. 40 meters ahead, there should have been an isolation door. In 1943, when steel ran short, the door had never been installed. The opening had been covered with boards and waterproof canvas. Beyond it lay an unfinished ventilation shaft, deeper than 15 meters, never placed on public evacuation signage, the kind of void that killed quietly. "Everyone stays where you are. No one moves," Franz ordered. His authority smothered the first flare of chaos. He could not rely on the map in his skull alone. He pulled a waterproof oilcloth bundle from his chest pocket and snapped it open. Inside was a thick stack of drawings, their edges worn soft. By the wavering light of a distant flashlight, he found their location. His finger ran along a corridor line and stopped on the orange note. Structure unfinished. Danger. Permanent seal required. Beside it, in older pencil, he had written, "Temporary barrier of boards and canvas. Load-bearing insufficient. Keep away." There was no time to rally others. Franz folded the sheets, tucked them away, and ran. He could feel the eyes behind him, the weight of expectation and the silent accusation aimed at the man who had been providing the last scraps of order. If the boy fell, it would not only be a life, it would be the collapse of the final system of trust he had been holding together. At the makeshift seal, the canvas had been pulled back at one corner. Fresh scrapes marked the boards. Beyond was a black mouth breathing cold, dusty air. "Max!" Franz called. His voice ricocheted in the tight concrete. No answer, but there was something faint, a thin thread of sobbing. He lay flat, slid his shoulders into the opening, and shone a flashlight down. The beam carved the darkness. 7 or 8 meters below, a concrete cross beam jutted out. The boy was curled on it, trembling. No obvious injury, but he could not climb. Below the beam was a deeper black that swallowed the light before it reached anything like a floor. Franz's mind confirmed the layout at speed. The shaft was a redundant segment of an early design. The beam was the remnant of a construction platform. Below was a real drop with a cluttered bottom. A fall from the beam would end there. Rescue required length, leverage, and an anchor. The plan called for a steel-embedded door frame at this opening. The door had never been mounted, but the frame should still be there. Franz rapped the concrete edge with his knuckles and heard the hollow ring of metal behind it. "Stay still, Max. Look at my light. Do not look down," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "I'm coming." He backed out and turned to the civilians. The mother was nearly collapsing, her hands clawing at her own hair. Franz organized the men with sharp gestures. "Find anything that could serve as rope. Wraps, belts, woven straps, line from packs." The bunker was never short on scraps. They twisted leg wraps, a discarded length of wire, even a torn coat into a crude rope that looked fragile and ugly but might bear a child's weight. Franz tested the frame and tied the rope hard, knot upon knot, his fingers working with the calm of repetition. Then a different sound cracked above them, not the distant thud of Soviet artillery, but sharper and closer. Quick gunfire, a compact explosion like a grenade or demolition charge. Dust sifted down. The corridor froze. A new fear pushed aside even the child's peril. Surface fighting had reached them, or ended. The gunfire stopped. A loudspeaker voice seeped down through ducts and cracks, faint but clear, German with a strange accent and correct grammar. "Attention, this bunker has been secured by United States Army forces. All German soldiers, lay down your weapons and proceed in an orderly manner to the main exit. You will be kept safe. Repeat, all German soldiers, surrender immediately. Americans, not Soviets." Among the civilians, terror shifted into wary relief and confusion. Some faces tightened with dread anyway, trained by years of raids and reprisals to expect the worst from any uniform. Others let out breaths they did not realize they had been holding. For many Berliners, the Americans were the better ending, the outcome they had whispered about when they dared whisper at all. For Franz, the word struck differently. He wore a uniform. He carried drawings. The message called for soldiers only. It did not promise anything to civilians, and it said nothing about technical men who could be treated as enemy resources. He helped lower the rope. The men hauled Max up, shaking and sobbing, and his mother crushed him in her arms. That crisis passed. Franz felt a larger one tightening. The Americans controlled the exits, and they would come down soon if they had not already. The bunker's complexity would slow them, but not for long. A place like this was not a single room, it was an organism. If a disciplined force put its hands on the right arteries, it would stop resisting. He retreated into shadow and unfolded the blueprint. The network had obscure exits and maintenance routes, some never recorded in standard archives, existing only on the constantly revised sheets he carried, he might hide until the situation clarified, or slip out through a remote opening with the drawings, the work of 20 years, and the only way he knew how to keep the world legible. Hand it to the Americans, and they would treat it as a tactical map, a means to sweep and seal. His notes about stress, hydrology, and fatigue would be ignored or worse, destroyed as irrelevant. Disciplined boot steps arrived from the main corridor, steady and unit coherent. Short English commands followed, sharp and measured. Team A, lock down this junction. Team B, search the left passage. Any armed personnel, warn first. The efficiency was chilling. Franz folded the blueprint and shoved it under his sweater. He stripped off his uniform jacket and tossed it into a recess, leaving only an old sweater and work trousers. He lowered his head and tried to become a tired, harmless mechanic among civilians. The Americans guided people toward the main exit. They were not rough. They lit the route with flashlights and spoke simple German words, go, this way. But their eyes were alert, rifles pointed down, fingers rested ready. At a broader intersection hall, they established a checkpoint. A young lieutenant ran the screen, working quickly because the flow behind him never stopped. Civilians stated identity and were directed to one side. Those who looked military were searched, disarmed, and sent elsewhere. The process was tense but controlled, the kind of control that came from practiced procedure rather than improvisation. Franz felt the bunker itself being turned into lanes, categories, and quotas. When Franz stepped forward, he rasped, "Civilian, maintenance worker." The lieutenant's light swept his face and the grime on his trousers. He almost waved Franz through. A middle-aged German officer under guard suddenly pointed and shouted in German, "Sir, that man, he is Sergeant Major Becker from the engineers. He knows this bunker. He has all the drawings." The lieutenant's gaze sharpened. Franz recognized the officer, a rear area logistics man who had begged him for routes days earlier. Franz had answered because he had answered so many questions in his life that the act had become automatic. Now that habit was being used against him. The officer's eyes were too bright, too eager, trying to purchase safety with betrayal. "Drawings?" the lieutenant repeated in stiff German. "You have a map, structural plans?" Franz did not pretend. He nodded. A soldier ran. Moments later, another officer arrived, older, perhaps 35 or 36, in a military police major's uniform with engineer insignia. His posture was not theatrical. He looked like a man inspecting a damaged work site, a manager measuring risk. "I am Major Royce," he said in fluent German. "You are the sergeant major responsible for maintenance of this underground facility." "Yes." "You have a complete structural blueprint." "Yes." "Where is it now?" Franz's hand drifted toward his chest. Royce saw it. "Hand it over." Two soldiers behind Royce shifted forward by half a step. Franz understood that resistance would bring force and could spill onto the civilians around him. He pulled out the oilcloth bundle, untied it, and placed the thick stack of drawings into Royce's hands. Royce did not flip through them at once. He weighed them as if taking the measure of a tool. He carried them to a cleared table, spread the sheets, and leaned in. Under flashlights and an emergency lamp, the yellowed paper became a dense miniature world. Corridors, branches, ventilation trunks, pump rooms, power distribution, storage bays. Royce's eyes moved fast, pausing at junctions in large spaces, extracting what he needed without comment. Then he took out a red and blue pencil. In red, he circled wide corridors tied to the main exit. Primary medical triage here, close to the exit. In blue, he boxed structurally strong zones with independent ventilation access. Civilian shelter areas, allocate by capacity, guard the entrances. He crossed out narrow branch-heavy corridors and areas marked for structural risk. Seal, no entry. Orders flowed out in rapid English. Soldiers and engineers shifted from general control to assigned tasks. Civilians were guided into the blue box areas. The wounded were carried toward the red circles. Crossed out corridors were blocked with markers and wire. The bunker, which had been a labyrinth of fear and rumor to the civilians, became a set of directed streams with checkpoints and closed doors. Franz watched the map he had maintained for defense and upkeep become, in minutes, a plan for crowd control, medical sorting, and hazard containment. His system was being reorganized by a logic that treated it as a machine to be stabilized and run. Royce stopped marking and studied Franz as if assessing a resource. Besides surrendered soldiers and trapped civilians, is there organized resistance in this bunker? Any unregistered hiding places? Franz wanted to say he was only maintenance, but he met Royce's engineer's gaze and understood that evasion would be useless and might provoke aggressive searches that could get civilians hurt. His obsession with keeping the system intact twisted into a new motive. If the Americans were going to run this place, he wanted them to run it without breaking it apart. He pointed to a few locations. Sector C7 has reinforced storerooms used late in the war. I cannot confirm they were cleared. Beside the D3 main ventilation route, there is a maintenance crawl space with a hidden entrance. A few stragglers might be there. Otherwise, most people are near the main corridors. Royce marked the points. You are coming with us. When needed, you will identify entrances and internal structure for everyone's safety. A temporary command post was set up in a wide shelter room near a main exit. Tables were pushed together and Franz's blueprint lay across them. Royce stood over it with Captain Miller and radio and clipboard sergeants. Franz was kept slightly back under guard, close enough to see the pencil and the shifting plan. Royce spoke with higher command in fast, precise English. The underground complex could hold more civilians than expected, but ventilation and water were bottlenecks. Certain areas were structurally unstable. Heavy movement or nearby shelling could trigger collapse. They would prioritize evacuation of wounded and non-combatants. When he clicked off, he turned back to the paper with the same hard focus. Miller raised questions about backup power feeds, fan trunks, and reservoirs. Franz answered when asked. Reservoir 1 rated at 1,200 cubic meters, roughly 80% at the last inspection in November before records stopped. Reservoir 2, 800, fed by seepage with unstable quality. Royce wrote the numbers and ordered that water from Reservoir 2 be boiled. He circled likely choke points and marked potential failure nodes with simple symbols that ignored the years of obsessive marginal notes. Where Franz saw long-term decay, Royce saw immediate risk. Where Franz saw a living record, Royce saw a decision aid. The difference in how Royce read the blueprint was stark. Franz had lived inside maintenance cycles, corrosion, stress cracks, the slow health of a system. Royce saw capacity, bottlenecks, failure points, and what could be used right now. It was surgical functionalism, a kind of engineering that did not care who had built the machine or why, only whether it could be forced to serve the current task. That discipline was, in its own way, cold. It could absorb civilian cries and soldier panic and turn them into problems with assigned owners and next actions. A harsh metallic scrape sounded deep in the ventilation network. The constant background hum weakened, then stopped. The air thickened almost immediately, as if the bunker exhaled and could not inhale again. Heat began to gather in small pockets. The lamp's halo looked tighter. "Ventilation failure," Miller said, scanning the plan. "Main assembly sector E4, backup adjacent E5. Manual controls and local emergency power are shown." Royce looked to Franz. "Was it running in the last 24 hours? Most recent maintenance?" "Yesterday morning it had power," Franz said. "Last full inspection was last August. Total stoppage suggests a main circuit or control issue." "Miller," Royce said, "take a team to E4 and E5. Tools, spare lamps. Becker, identify the safest route and manual restart points." Under guard, Franz traced corridors. The shortest route past a protective door jammed by last year's collapsed debris. The longer route was clear. He pointed out a drainage channel that could choke emergency generator exhaust and the manual clutch that required 2 men. The instructions came out of him like a manual being read aloud. Miller's team left. The command post returned to its rhythm, but the air grew worse by degrees. Franz felt a sharpened anxiety. The fan sector sat near old storage and dormitory zones that he could not swear were empty. Even in peacetime, those areas could swallow a man. In wartime, they could hide him. Gunfire cracked underground 20 minutes later, short bursts and return shots, echoing off concrete. The radio operator called Miller's team. Static answered at first, then Miller's breathless voice broke through. "E4 access point took fire. At least 2, maybe more inside. Automatic weapons. Hansen hit in the arm. Light. We pulled back. Mission not completed. Fan room entrance is locked down by fire." Royce's expression tightened. He went back to the blueprint and stabbed a finger onto the rectangles adjacent to E4. "Are these internally connected? Maintenance conduit, pipe chase, unmarked door." Franz swallowed. "E4 is reinforced, but the third equipment room beside it had a conduit opening, small, but a man could crawl through. That was years ago. I cannot confirm it was sealed." Royce made a decision at once. He ordered Miller to attempt a flank through adjacent rooms, look for the conduit, and if found, use smoke or concussion to clear or seal it. Primary task: restore ventilation or confirm it cannot be restored so alternate evacuation could begin. At the same time, he paused transfers into Sector C, shelter zones near the fan rooms, and ordered capacity calculations to reroute civilians into Sectors A and B. On paper, blocks of civilians moved as easily as chess pieces. In the bunker, they moved by foot, fear, and breath, and now breath was the threatened resource. Then Royce faced Franz again. "I need you to identify every similar structure, every defensible room, every place scattered personnel could use as a resistance point. Not only what you already named, all of them." The demand made Franz's stomach turn. He understood the logic. If resistance remained, ventilation might not be restored and evacuation might collapse into panic. Still, it meant exposing the bunker's last unknown corners to systematic clearance. His blueprint, drawn to preserve and defend, was being used to strip the space of uncertainty. He could feel a rifle behind him as a quiet reminder that refusal was not part of the plan. Yet the stronger pressure came from his own sense of the system. If the Americans failed here, civilians would pay. If they succeeded, his knowledge would become the lever of that success. He lowered his eyes and began pointing, naming likely locations in a rough, dry voice. Each one felt like a thread severed. A low mechanical rumble interrupted him. Air hissed through ducts. The backup fan had started, Miller's voice came over the radio, exhausted. E5 backup fan is running. Manual start successful. Resistance pulled back during the flank attempt. They escaped through an unmarked vent opening into deeper abandoned zones. We sealed all known exits. Ventilation is back to about 60%. E4 still needs service. That is enough, Roy said. He glanced at Franz with a colder scrutiny, not blame so much as a recalibration. The blueprint had gaps. Late war modifications had created openings even Franz had not recorded, and an engineer who claimed a complete system suddenly looked less complete. Evacuation resumed with a harder edge of caution. Soldiers watched every corridor and door. Franz kept identifying possible hide sites, the work becoming more granular and more emptying. His knowledge was being converted into checklists and clearance routes. His map was still his map, but it no longer spoke his language. Then the bunker shuddered under a heavy surface bombardment. Concrete groaned, dust fell like rain, emergency lights swung. People ducked and clutched each other. The shaking eased after seconds, and then a new sound rose from the northeastern Sector C area, a continuous rushing, water slamming concrete, threaded with the tearing scream of a ruptured pipe. A U.S. engineer stumbled into the command post, soaked and muddy. Major, Sector C perimeter, main water line cracked, high pressure backflowing into Corridor C12, waters rising fast. That corridor is a main access route to the C assembly area. If it floods, 200-plus civilians could be trapped. In a sealed underground space, water was worse than gunfire. It drowned routes, wrecked power, and turned fear into stampede. Royce dragged the wet engineer toward the blueprint. Exact rupture point. Show me the line and the shutoff controls. Miller pointed to a dense knot of pipework at the C and D boundary. Near node D7, main trunk maybe 30 centimeters. We cannot find the nearest isolation valve. A local copy got soaked and smeared. Royce lifted his head and locked onto Franz. His voice lost its smoothness. Becker, node D7. Where is the shutoff? If it is stuck or unreachable, how do we stop inflow to C12? Any pump station to divert or drain, speak now. Franz heard his own heart. Faces from Sector C flashed in his mind, civilians who had clung to the thin hope of an orderly exit. There was no time for loyalty, shame, or irony. 2 decades of valves and pumps and failures engaged on instinct. He stepped to the table and placed his finger on the complete master diagram. Not a standard isolation valve. A triple diversion control gate. 3 hand wheels must be closed together. Turn clockwise to the stop. It is on a service platform 1.5 meters above node D-7. Access from corridor D6 through a side shaft with a rusted grate. You need a ladder. He continued without pause. If the gate cannot fully close due to pressure or corrosion, run backup drainage. From mid-corridor C12 down into the C maintenance well, about 8 meters, bottom west side, there is a manually started centrifugal pump tied to a line into the lower drainage culvert. Clear the culvert mouth first, or you will get backflow. 2 men on the crank, at least 15 minutes to build draw. Royce forced Miller to repeat the steps, word for word, as if translating speech into procedure. Then he issued orders that cut through the room. 1 team to the D6 shaft for the triple gate, another to the C maintenance well for the hand pump, tools, lights, communications. Do both, and do them fast. Time stretched into raw minutes. The radio carried grinding noise, shouted cadence. The the harsh scrape of tools on seized wheels, and, deeper, the low groan of a hand pump beginning to move. Miller reported that the hand wheels were rusted solid and needed prying and breeching tools. The pump team reported debris at the culvert mouth, but said it could be cleared. Water in C-12 rose above the knee. Someone in a forward corridor shouted measurements. Someone else shouted at him to keep moving people back. Fear moved ahead of the water, filling lungs faster than the flood could fill a hallway. Franz shut his eyes and saw the scenes as if drawn on the paper itself. Men forcing corroded wheels, sweat mixing with rust water, 2 soldiers in a dim well turning a crank like a millstone, each rotation pushing floodwater toward a lower channel. He had spent a life writing notes in margins so that failures could be solved without guesswork. Now those notes were coming alive in strangers' hands. Then the radio snapped with Miller's relief. Gate is closed. All 3 bottomed, leak rate dropping hard. A beat later, the pump team reported, pump is stable, water is going down, it is working. In the command post, shoulders dropped in tired breath. The roar of water faded into a weaker splatter than a steady drip. Corridor C-12 held. 200 civilians would not be trapped in a flooding choke point. No one cheered. The relief was physical and silent, the kind that left the body hollow after it passed. Franz opened his eyes and stared into the dim corridor beyond the command room. In the moment of maximum pressure, he had functioned like a hammer swung hard and true. Now the hammer had been set down. What he felt was not pride, but the sick clarity of being reduced to a tool. His skill, which he had told himself was neutral, had proven its value, and that value had been harvested by the American machine of order. The goals had overlapped for a moment, keep people alive, but the meaning belonged to the stronger system that had the authority to claim results. Royce's voice returned to flat control. Transfers could resume after structural checks. Keep the hand pump running until the water was confirmed clear. Check other lines for secondary damage. Then Royce looked at Franz again with that same appraising stare, as if noting a component's performance, and moved on without a word. The hand pump's rhythmic groan continued for more than an hour, a stubborn heartbeat pushing water out of a system that should not have been flooding. Mud and debris remained, but the corridor stayed passable. The backup fan kept enough air moving to hold off suffocation. Engineers braced, checked, and marked danger points. An external, efficient, faintly cold order settled into the bunker, replacing the frantic, improvised order Franz had tried to maintain with nothing but memory, paper, and force of will. Franz was kept near the command post, guarded in a quieter corner. Reports on the radio shifted from urgent bursts to controlled updates. The bunker's major failures were being brought under control. Royce spent longer over the blueprint, moving slower now, doing final verification and hunting omissions. He was no longer improvising a takeover. He was auditing a system. At last, his fingers stopped on a marginal area, a deep northeastern corner labeled long-term storage, low priority, reached by a narrow, twisting corridor. Franz had visited it once when the blueprint was new and then let it drift into irrelevance. It had never failed. It had never needed him. Royce looked at Franz. When was this last checked? Could it hold personnel? Any unrecorded routes? Not since the war began, Franz said. It should contain early engineering surplus, cast iron pipe, old boards, reinforced vault, One entrance, a heavy blast door. Vent intake is small and tied to a branch duct. A man cannot fit. It is remote, poor airflow, no water, he added. Under normal conditions, no one would hide there. Under normal conditions, Royce repeated, dismissing the comfort of the phrase. Under abnormal conditions, a hardened, isolated space can be attractive. He ordered a combat team to inspect with breaching tools and told Franz to come and identify the entrance at distance. Escorted, Franz followed a 6-man team down the rarely used corridor. The air held heavier dust and sealed staleness. The flashlight beams caught old signage and flaking paint. Pipes ran along the ceiling like ribs in a dead body. At the end stood the iron door, paint peeling, lock buried under rust and gray powder. It looked like a thing that had been forgotten on purpose. The team deployed, a pry bar failed, a small breaching charge was set at the lock. On command, they withdrew behind cover. The blast was muffled but sharp in the confined space. Metal twisted, dust surged. Before smoke cleared, the team went in with rifles raised and flashlights crossing. Franz heard German shouting, not surrender, but desperate cursing, the sound of men who knew the war was over but could not accept the word. Then crisp American bursts answered, the flat, close sound of an M1 carbine in concrete. A grenade thumped. The exchange ended in seconds, so fast it felt like a single mechanical act. "Clear," someone called. The team leader emerged and spoke into his radio. Room contained 4 German soldiers, refused surrender, engaged and neutralized. No other personnel. Mission complete. Bodies were carried out on stretchers with efficient blankness as if clearing debris. Franz stared at the blasted doorway and felt an unexpected lightness, a drained release. The final unknown corner of the system had been solved without him. His role as keeper was not merely reduced. It was finished. Whatever responsibility he had carried for hidden risks, even the risks he had forgotten, had been stripped away by force and procedure. Back near the main exit, the earlier crush had thinned. Civilians had largely been moved to a surface holding area. Wounded had been transported. German prisoners were assembled and marched toward daylight. The command post was being packed away. The blueprint had been folded with care and sealed into a clean, waterproof case, not treated as enemy trash, but as a valuable instrument. As Franz was escorted past, he caught a fragment of Royce's English conversation with another engineer, spoken in the tone of a technical summary rather than a compliment. The drafting is astonishingly precise. Stress annotations, pipe aging assessment, hydrology seat points. Those notes alone will keep survey teams busy for weeks. Without it today, we never find the drain pump station and the manual start procedure that fast. The flooding at Sector C would likely have turned into a disaster. Casualties would be something else. Royce did not turn to look at him. He did not raise his voice. He simply stated facts about a tool's performance. Franz's pace faltered for a fraction of a step. He kept his eyes forward toward the natural light spilling in brighter and brighter. It was the dawn of May 3rd or May 4th. His body, locked tight for 3 days, loosened by the smallest amount. He let out a long breath that tasted of old concrete and stale air. He had not been thanked. he had not been treated as a man. Yet he had heard the most professional acknowledgment possible. His work had been used, and it had prevented deaths. It could not absolve the war's crimes or erase that he belonged to the defeated side. But it granted him, as a craftsman rather than a believer, one last sliver of dignity. What he had built had been useful, and in the cruelty of circumstance it had been used well. He stepped out into daylight. The brightness made him squint. The air was cold and clean, carrying smoke and pulverized masonry. Berlin's skyline lay shattered in the dawn, and toward the Reichstag smoke still climbed. He did not look back at the underground kingdom that had taken half his life. The blueprint belonged to the Americans now, bound for an engineer archive as a key document on Berlin's subterranean infrastructure, and Franz Becker, former Sergeant Major of Germany's Air Defense Engineering Troops, was now only one quiet 58-year-old man in a line of prisoners. He walked with them over rubble, feeling an odd, bitter calm. The order he had maintained was finished. Another order, efficient and cold and never his, had replaced it. His value had been tallied and collected. At last he could set down the weight of the system and face what came next simply as a defeated man.